Good day and welcome to the Literate Patriot. In this special response, we'll talk about the shooting death of 12-year-old Tamir Rice, an African-American boy who demonstrated to himself and the community at large that indeed he did pose a threat to himself and others. As well, we'll talk about Officer Timothy Loman, who learned on December 28, 2015, along with the rest of America, that he will not face an indictment for the murder of Tamir Rice. Learning this flamed already tense relationships between African Americans and the police officers who were supposed to serve African American communities rather than slaughter them at will. The Wall Street Journal reported on December 28th that Tamir's family said they were, quote, saddened and disappointed by this outcome, but not surprised, end quote, according to a statement cited by the Associated Press. The family accused Mr. Gitney of, quote, abusing and manipulating the grand jury process to orchestrate a vote against indictment, end quote. They renewed a request for the United States Justice Department to step in and conduct a separate investigation. That from the Wall Street Journal, and the quote, of course, attributed to the Associated Press. The lack of indictment of Officer Timothy Loman flamed already tense relationships between officers in the African American communities they're supposed to serve rather than slaughter at large. These protests naturally spilled onto social media sites such as Twitter. Former Bowie State athlete and political activist Tariq Touré tweeted at Cleveland Cavaliers small forward Lebron James this tweet: "It's more than a game and you know it, at King James. Hashtag no justice, no LeBron," for hashtag Tamir Rice. And in this move of social and political activism, there was of course a bit of contention between the electorate at large, with tweets from many different people calling for LeBron James to sit out and calling for LeBron James to ignore calls to sit out and to continue to play with the Cleveland Cavaliers. And we have a tweet from Wes Bellamy who says, "I understand people want LeBron James to stand up, but I don't agree with hashtag no justice, no LeBron. He's done a ton for Cleveland, always speaks out and leads." And another tweet from someone, Kwame Rose: "We wouldn't have to tweet Muhammad Ali, no justice, no LeBron." And so the tweet from Tariq Touré to LeBron James has created an additional conversation, the conversation of the role of athletes in standing up in the African American community. So the questions are, is this a one-off situation? Why is LeBron James being asked? Is it because he's an athlete, an African American athlete who happens to be playing in Cleveland right now? Why weren't other African American athletes in Cleveland asked to stand up, as LeBron James was asked to stand up? And what should LeBron James have done? Well, to answer all of these questions, we have to go back, way back to Booker T. Washington. So why do we go back to Booker T. Washington? Well, for the purposes of this, is to understand that Booker T. Washington believed in industrial education, that former slaves needed to become useful to the community, needed to know how to do things and prosper, and that the only way to prosper was through this sort of industrial education. So why is this important? It's important because, in particular, Booker T. Washington was completely at odds with his contemporary, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, or as you may know him, W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois believed in almost the exact opposite. W.E.B. Du Bois believed that in order for the African American community to develop, grow, and prosper, the intelligentsia of the African American community, or the top 10%, would be needed to bring up the African American community. And he puts it this way in his foundation of the Niagara Movement, which would later become the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. W.E.B. Du Bois says, "The American Negro Academy believes that upon those of the race who have had the advantage of higher education and culture rests the responsibility of taking concerted steps for the employment of these agencies to uplift the race to higher planes of thought and action." W.E.B. Du Bois is also credited with helping the Harlem Renaissance come to fruition in the 1920s and 1930s. And during this movement, the intelligentsia, in a very concerted effort, grouped together to grow and develop culturally relevant African American works. And what was the goal of this? The goal of this movement was to allow other African Americans to read and to see and to hear through literature and movies and songs, lyrical songs and non-lyrical songs, jazz and blues and other works other notable works, self-published works, for them to understand and see the African American experience. This was also to make the African American experience mainstream. It was to have white America, mainstream America, understand what it was like to be African American in the roaring 20s. And so, in order to understand why Cleveland Cavaliers small forward LeBron James is being asked in 2015 to stand up for the shooting death of Tamir Rice and a lack of indictment for Officer Timothy Loman, why do we go back to the Harlem Renaissance? Well, we go back to the Harlem Renaissance to understand what that was about. The competing ideologies of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois are just as relevant today. This is my dog Fox. The competing ideologies of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois are just as relevant today. In that Booker T. Washington believed in industrial education and that was the best way for African Americans to grow and prosper. W.E.B. Du Bois believed in the exact opposite. He believed in the intelligentsia. But they both believed in the growth and prosperity of African Americans. Even within the Harlem Renaissance, there was contention. Zora Neale Hurston notably hated the prim and proper airs of her northern counterparts, being from Alabama. She hated the prim and proper airs that they put on in this sort of reverence and deference to their white counterparts and in this sort of imitation of their white counterparts. But even in that, they all had this sort of goal of growing the African American community. W.E.B. Du Bois, for example, hated jazz music. He thought that it was too raunchy and too dirty. He thought that white people would shy away from it. But in Prohibition America, white people loved jazz music, and it was a prominent feature in some of those underground clubs, and it became one of the main ways that whites and blacks sort of began to commingle. And W.E.B. Du Bois later retracted his statement on his dislike of jazz music. So how does this bring us to 2015? Because at the time, the industrial education versus the competing ideology of the intelligentsia as the way to bring up the African American were the only two ways that anyone could see for growth and development. At the time, you didn't have black billionaires or black millionaires. Black business owners weren't really a thing. It would take some years for them to truly develop a black Wall Street, for example. You didn't have prominent black athletes. Boxing was still, for the most part, segregated. Baseball was still segregated. Many sports were still segregated at this time. And so these were the only two pathways that anyone could see for growth and development. But then time continued and you had the civil rights movement. And at the same time the civil rights movement happened, this coincided with the prominence and the growth of the African American athlete. And as the African American athlete grew, something amazing happened. Athletes were seen everywhere. White people watch sports. White people love sports. And the African American athlete grew in prominence. Most notably, of course, we have Jackie Robinson, who in his activism corresponded with many people, including President Eisenhower. We have Muhammad Ali, who took a stand against the Vietnam War and for his actions was not allowed to box again. We have the Olympians, whose actions were memorialized. Tommie Smith and John Carter, who, when standing up while the Star-Spangled Banner played, wore no shoes and wore other parcels to stand in solidarity with their African American community, to show the world the plight of the African American in the United States, the lynchings, the beatings, the burnings, the fact that African Americans didn't have shoes, at the same time that there were two prominent African American athletes who had just won the gold and bronze medal respectively. And so at the same time that you have, on the one hand, in the United States, African Americans being beaten and lynched and burned, you have Olympic athletes in front of the entire world showing that they can do something respectfully to show the plight of the African American community, to show the condition of the African American community. And that's how the power of the African American athlete began to resonate within the African American community and became added to the sort of intelligentsia, the industrial worker, and almost became more important than the intelligentsia and the industrial worker, because the African American athlete was mainstream. Everyone would see what the African American athlete was doing, but the intelligentsia and the worker were sort of in the background. And then you fast forward a bit, And as athletes have become more prominent and there are more African American athletes, there's sort of this duology going on where more African Americans have progressed socioeconomically. And yet, at the same time that there's been this growth within the African American community where many African Americans have been allowed to progress along the socioeconomic ladder, there's been this dual fraction. The first dual fraction has been the systematic exploitation and oppression that has continued along the more systemic lines. And the second has been the communal fraction. Those African Americans that tend to have done extremely well socioeconomically, no matter where they come from, have tended to do less and less for the direct community in large and controversial ways. They tend to still support the community, but not in those very controversial ways that you would have seen from athletes like Jackie Robinson, like Muhammad Ali, like Tommie Smith and John Carter. And so what you have in the community is this lack of representation. The grassroots representation is stronger than ever, and there are platforms that we can also thank for that, such as Twitter and Facebook. And so what you have in the community is a lack of representation among African Americans who have reached a certain socioeconomic status, among athletes, writers, musicians, and other people among the intelligentsia, the industrial class, and those that, like I said, have reached a certain socioeconomic plateau. And so the call for LeBron James to step up is unique in the fact that typically in the African American community, this fracture hasn't been there, where African American leadership hasn't needed to be asked to step up. They've typically been within the community, on the ground, doing things to show their solidarity within the community, even things that have been controversial, even at risk to themselves, most notably in the case of Muhammad Ali, Jackie Robinson, Timothy Smith, and John Carter. So was LeBron James right or wrong to continue playing for the Cleveland Cavaliers even after he was asked by over 8,000 people to sit out until justice was served for Tamir Rice? In his statement, LeBron James said, quote, "For me, I've always been a guy who took pride in knowledge of every situation that I've ever spoken on. And to be honest, I haven't really been on top of this issue, so it's hard for me to comment." He added, quote, "I caught a little bit of it from my folks on the side saying that you guys might ask me about it, but I have no knowledge." Then he said, quote, "I'm not much of a social media guy. I'm on it for sure, but I'm not always looking at what's going on in it," end quote. So was LeBron James right or wrong in this response? Well, LeBron James probably responded like any human would after being pressured to sit out for games until justice was served for Tamir Rice. It probably felt as if even if he had sat out, his response would have been disingenuous because he hadn't thought of it himself. And LeBron James has stood up for other issues within the African American community, and his charitable works are very long. So that's where the African American community is. And taking the response of one African American athlete is probably a bit more pressure than even LeBron James deserves. Rather, what should probably be looked at is the increasing fracture in the African American community, especially those that continue to reach a certain socioeconomic bracket. With that, I look forward to hearing your thoughts and reading your thoughts. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Please follow the Literate Patriot on Twitter. Please take a look at my podcasting page. I'll have the links for all of those, as well as the links for all of the articles I referenced in this video in the details section below. I look forward to reading all of your comments. Thanks.